we are 76 years later, and we know how technology improves. Remember, 1945, there's no cell phones. There are no Nintendos. Technology has improved significantly since then, and that's the weapons that we know about, not the classified ones. So this remains a very real concern, and I'm certain that what could be released now would be even what happened in 1945 is unimaginably horrific. And that the stakes, I imagine, have only gotten higher in that regard. So obviously we want to reach out to, I love that you're focused on younger people and future voters, but what can citizens actively do to help prevent another nuclear launch?
I think the more that they can find out about nuclear weapons, the more they can find out what they can do, and then read on the people such as not just the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, but you also have the atomic testing survivors and what had happened to them in Bikini Atoll and in the other areas of the United States where they first tried out the atomic bombing. But also, I think what they need to understand is, well, at least that's how I feel, is that they need to make that connection to those people, to that connection to the idea, that I could be that person, that could be my family. And I think that by having that, because as you said, technology does change, the way we do meetings changed, this past year, there was huge changes, but that need for connecting with another human being, that's timeless to me. And I feel that the more that we focus on that, then the idea of using nuclear weapons makes no sense once you get to that point. And I think, there's no such thing as a small nuclear weapon, that's still going to do so much damage. One of the things that I do also talk about in my talks with students is that the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had the strength of 15,000 tons of TNT. And it did so much damage, and it killed over 150,000 people over the 5 years afterwards. But the largest one that we know of that is in our arsenal today has the strength of 1.2 million tons of TNT. And it amazes me to think that they feel something so large is what we must have. And it's also the fact that even if we didn't deploy it and it was used, I give them this example that I've heard before on the BBC, is that if India and Pakistan each used an atomic weapon against each other, maybe even a little bit smaller than the one dropped on Hiroshima, there'd be so much smoke in the stratosphere, it would block like 10% of the sunlight to the earth. And that would affect everyone around the world. So it's not just the fact of one obliterating the other, which is horrible enough, but even if you want to say, well, we didn't do it and it's over there, it no longer is, well, it happened over there, it won't affect us, especially since so many people now have them. And I think that sometimes we get away from the fact of the humanity, and there's a lot of talk about numbers and how expensive it is and the politics, but they get too much away from the actual people and what they had gone through. And that's what I hope to bring, is that human aspect. I'm not a scientist, I know bits and pieces of it, but I can bring that humanity and that emotional piece of it to remind them, that such a smaller bomb killed 80,000 people immediately. Some just evaporated because of the heat was so intense. There's nothing left of them. My mother lost her whole family that she knew, her best friend that day. And I think they need to realize that they were just going about their lives. And you have to kind of realize whenever you use some kind of weapon like this, you're hitting the citizens, the people. You may dislike or even hate the leaders, but you're not affecting them. You're affecting the people. And just as we someday could be subject to it as well. I've been so lucky to speak with thousands of students, especially through Zoom, around the world. And the one thing they tell me after I speak is that move them to want to make action, to want to find out more about nuclear disarmament, is not the statistics, not the info about the treaties, which are all important, but it's that story of that little girl. Because they could see themselves in her. They could see that be their family that they lost, their best friend. And that's what then makes them want to talk to their parents about it, who are voters now, who can look up more information about it. And the more that people talk about it and realize, I think that eventually it can stop what we're doing. There's going to be steps, and it's not going to be easy, especially because the United States, US and Russia have the most nuclear warheads. And even though there was a treaty that was signed by the United Nations and ratified about not using nuclear weapons and making them illegal, the United States and Russia did not sign it. And neither did Japan, because Japan kind of falls under the umbrella of the United States. So they wouldn't go against that. And it is seeming like an uphill battle at times, but I think that the more that we talk about it, the more that we remember what happened and put that in front of people, that it can't help but soak in eventually. And I just hope that, when I'm not able to do it anymore, that my daughter can do it. And that in some small way, we keep their memories alive, because their stories can't die with them. There's not many survivors left anymore. And we need to make sure that by telling their stories, I hope it tells the readers that their stories are important, whether they're immigrants, whether they're from war-torn countries, that their stories matter and they need to be told too. And I think if we start focusing more on each other and our stories and us as people, I don't know, maybe it's kind of Pollyanna, but I really feel that eventually then maybe we will see certain things should not exist any longer, like weapons of mass destruction. So.
Well, 76 years later, I'm talking to you and you're being impacted by an event that you weren't there for. I'm sure that there are, that the death count has to be severely undercounted for that event, because God knows how many cases of cancer and other diseases long after, and people who are still suffering, probably still contracting poison from certain areas there. So we may never know what the total toll was. I do something that catches me, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Is, like I said, we're 76 years later. We know that humanity is, in a sense, had a loaded gun pointed to our head all of this time. That has always been some level of threat, but it has not happened. So when we're talking about a Pollyanna event that we haven't had a total nuclear annihilation, knock on wood, as of this recording, does that give you hope, or is that dangerous to have hope to say that it hasn't happened yet? We need to keep constant vigilance to continue that. And why do you think maybe it hasn't happened?
Wow, that's a very good question. Okay. Well, I guess in a sense, I could say I'm a little hopeful because it hasn't happened. I'm hopeful because it's still being talked about, at least, for whatever the reasons are behind it in politics, it's being discussed. It's being brought out and being brought out in the open. So I'm hoping that because of that, that can help with some deterrence. But at the same time, I worry because, we are tempted to remake the same horrific mistakes. We found that with the Japanese internment, and then, with the idea of what they're doing now with the people who are coming in from Mexico and putting them in places. And it's like, well, we didn't really learn from one instance and we're still doing it. And so it scares me that the longer we go, if we don't start making some clear progress, back in I think it was the 80s when we had Gorbachev and Reagan. I mean, they at least started to reduce the nuclear weapons. They realized that, nuclear war is not something that's won by anyone. Even if you're not attacked, nobody really wins in that case. I just wish that we could kind of get back to that focus. And we're trying to. I mean, they've got things now as no first use that we're trying to get past, that we won't be the first use to do it. It would only be as a reactionary. But at the same time, the longer we're away from what happened, the older our equipment and the missiles are. And so the more you're at chance of something going wrong. And there have been close calls throughout the years. Even in North Carolina, I think it was near Greensboro, it was I think it was the 70s. There was a plane that was carrying atomic weapons, and something went wrong and it fell. But luckily the switch thing didn't turn on, so it never went off. So there are these near misses that happen, and miscommunications happen between countries sometimes. And that's the concern as well, is that the older this equipment is, the more chance that you have of somebody getting into it. And then if you update the equipment, you also have a chance nowadays that someone could hack into it. And so by just one small thing, to think of how many thousands of people could die because of that. I think it's there's hope, and at the same time there's, well, we're kind of down a ticking clock here because we don't know what could happen accidentally as well as just intentionally.
There is a wonderful 60 Minutes piece I came across when I was doing research for the Book of David, which features some nuclear launches. It's one of the most horrific, terrifying things I've ever seen. I'll link to it, and it's a tour of a modern facility for nuclear launch. And they go there, and the door is propped open with a crowbar. They've still got floppy disk, and they've got like 19-year-olds who are, it's the least desirable grunt work is to sit down there in the bunker and guard the codes in case the red phone rings and it's time to go to it. And it just shows how poorly maintained some of these facilities are. And I'm with you. I wish this was far more of a mainstream concern. And it's easy, I think, to get complacent, especially if you think of just the mushroom cloud, just that image that's the start of a video game and nothing more, as opposed to, I've sort of lost that thought there, other than I'm horrified and I want other people to be too, not to be paralyzed in fear, but because we want them to take action. We want them to get involved.
Exactly. I want them to be able to see the seriousness and what could happen, and that it's not just a maybe someday, it could really, really happen. And I think it's so important that they start to read as much as they can on it, or mostly get to understand the stories. Because I think when we start understanding the stories about people, you understand them better. Your relationship is with them better when you see that commonality. And that's what I really hope, more than anything, that I'm bringing with this, and that I'll continue to do.